How are you doing?
Well, I'm good. I'm finally de-jet lagged, so that's nice.
Thank you for doing this. So obviously, I've been interviewing former students. So though you are not a former student, I do know that you've had a very unique educational journey. So if you want to kind of start us off by sharing some of that.
I studied my entire life in Pakistan, which is where I've grown up. I went to a private school over here, but which is kind of, I think you'll find the majority of Pakistanis aim, I guess, to put their kids in private school, given the state of public school in our country. We follow the British system. That's kind of also what our public school model is based on. But in public school, they follow a system which is called metric and FSC. So the final exams for metric and FSC levels happen through a board which is locally run. And in comparison to that, if you're going to a private school, you will generally be doing O and A levels. So I guess the best comparison to that is owls and newts for those of those people who have read kind of Harry Potter. Um,
Yeah.
but the boards are run through the UK, so you're kind of you're competing, I guess, more internationally, but in a sense the real thing, I guess, with O and A levels is so O levels happens ninth, 10th, 11th grade,
Okay.
and kind of A levels is 12th and 13th.
You have SATs as well.
Yes, well, for those of us who want to study in the US, we also have SATs, and then later on we have GREs. So we have the entire gamut of all the acronyms going on.
Once you studied in Pakistan, then where did your educational path take you?
I just knew that I wanted to go abroad, which is really funny because I don't think that is the goal for everyone. I think everyone has kind of their own goals. I ended up at McGill, which is in Montreal. Ended up spending 3.5 years there.
So from Pakistan to then McGill, what were some things that you wish you were better prepared for, or do you think you were very well prepared for?
I had been so excited about the prospect of leaving that I hadn't really thought about what it would be like to leave and
Mm.
wasn't particularly prepared for that. And I say that because there are some places where you can go. And I think this is particularly true of my friends who ended up going to school in the US, where, you have like a very dorm centered life for the first maybe 1 to 2 years, and you're very taken care of.
Mm.
And I don't think that was necessarily true of McGill. I lived in alternative housing. I had gone for like the cheapest housing that I could find, and it was called a Moore House. And it was not dorm style. It was basically like a converted house.
Okay.
And it was like 12 of us lived there. And, you had responsibility for your own kitchen and your bathrooms and your lounge. And it was just like living with many roommates in one house, essentially. And so I was very unprepared with just the basics of fending for yourself.
Mm.
Oh, yeah, you have to pay bills. They charge you separately for that. And so you have to keep that into account. You have to budget properly. You have to cook for yourself. You have to clean for yourself. And you also have to learn how to negotiate with roommates who perhaps are not doing some of that. I was very lucky. I was very close to my undergrad roommate, and we had a great relationship. But there were small things. I remember once I hadn't been able to sleep all night. I ended up sleeping late, and she had a call at like 8 in the morning, and it was one room that we were sharing. And I woke up and was just furious at her. And we kind of had a huge row about it. And later, I mean, I look back on that and I'm like, wow, you really did not know how to deal with like conflict or manage conflict well. And ours was a good example of a relationship, whereas there were other relationships in the house where it became very acrimonious. People kind of like created walls in their rooms to stay away from each other. And I think what that's representational of is essentially that you're not taught not just basic life skills, which I guess there are classes for, especially in some places of the world, but you're not really taught how to manage conflict or negotiate in the kind of minor ways that you have to do.
And then what were things that you feel you were really well prepared for?
But the thing that I was really well prepared for was in some ways in some ways the academics, and I'll say some ways because there were some ways in which we weren't particularly well prepared for them. I think there
Okay.
is a particular drive in Pakistan which is, very focused on the learning aspect of school and not so much on the
Mm,
extracurriculars. Extracurriculars are very much something that you do for the sake of doing it to get to some end goal. It's not necessarily that you're taking
mm,
enjoyment in the process. And so
mm.
I think people who come out of this system of schooling are well prepared to manage the burden of academia. I think you can adapt well to that. You know how to deal with that pressure. And I think that you're very quickly able to assess what will be good for me in the future and plug yourself into that. But the things that you're not good at, by that same token, are things that are slightly out of your comfort zone. So things that are more creative, things that are more about, application as opposed to just learning. Are you pushing beyond just the surface level involvement that you have with something? Are you trying to build relationships in this arena,
Right.
which go beyond kind of surface level things? Are you being taught skills that are not just about surviving, but are really about thriving in alternative environments? And
Yeah.
I think that that's what was missing. I think reflecting back on my time, especially in undergrad, what I come out of it with, I managed to, it was a different environment, but I also got very lucky in that, I kind of was in a small space where I was living. I found friends in that small space,
Right.
and I found that to be fulfilling. But it didn't really force you to push yourself or live beyond those bounds, i- in in a way beyond the obvious, right? Life is very gold when you're younger. It is very clear and structured that I'm going to do X and then Y and then Z. And then suddenly you find yourself at a point where everything is a white space, which
Yeah.
is fantastic because that means that there's a lot of space to draw in. And for someone who is very gold, I find that it probably hits us harder than
Yeah.
it does others. But I mean, talking to my friends, this is it's a very universal
Experience.
experience. I think if you were given, or there were kind of more spaces where you experience that freedom, I
Mm.
think you would handle it better, once you come to those stages.
I know you mentioned managing conflict and providing more space for freedom. When you got to McGill, was there anything that you found, or even now, I guess, looking back, that you found like, oh, I wish I had learned this when I was younger, or I wish I had learned X or Y when I was younger in school, particularly?
This is going to sound silly. This was particularly with regards to literature. They would, they made you write papers. It was
Yeah.
like research papers or whatever. And I was like, I have no earthly clue what this is. It took me, I think, like a year and a half, honestly, to get my head around like how is this distinct from what I've done before? And what do you mean you want
Right.
10,000 words in something? I mean, I'm sure for some people that's not hard. For me, it was like very like, how is there not a more specific prompt? And how am I not just directly
Yeah.
responding to that as opposed
Yeah.
to a general research paper? Just the concept of like having to identify a thesis on your own
Mm.
and then figuring out resources to support that.
Is there a different approach to writing essays or research in Pakistan?
Yeah, I mean, it's more specified. I remember the most interesting essays for literature exam used to be, put yourself in this character's shoes during this scene and write from their perspective. So it is
Mm.
that specific that yes, it is giving you creativity, but it is giving it within still in a very bounded way. And
Right.
so you're going from a system which is quite bounded to something that is suddenly very
Mm.
unbounded and is forcing you to both identify and create those structures itself. And I found over time, as someone who has now become very deeply involved with research, ironically, is that it is very much like, I mean, we call it double diamonding, right? Like it is very much a process of you come close to something, you think you're close at it, and then suddenly it breaks apart again. And then you
Mm.
have to kind of re-identify what you're doing.
Yep.
And so there is an inherent frustration that comes with that process of kind of discovery and learning.
Yes.
But when you have no concept of it whatsoever, it can feel quite frightening. And I think you just more aware of that as you grow older, honestly. But at the time, like from specifically an academic point of view, that was something that was very much unknown to me.
It's almost like you have to discover yourself in that process at the same time as a learner. And as like, I remember when I first started college, I really felt like I had to learn how to study or what worked best for me, what was most effective for me. So I feel like that's mixed into all of the other things. So I definitely can relate to what you're saying.
What you were saying about like learning to learn, that's such a big theme. That kind of, I think, to me is like the entire point of university, is that there is a point where you're like, especially during particular type of degrees, and I will say this especially for like my literature things, there's a point where you're like, I cannot humanly do all this reading. There's a point where you're like, you have so much to do that you cannot humanly do all of it. And so there is a point where you're like learning to prioritize, and you are learning how to study all over again. And that's something that I think you end up taking forward with you, particularly in working life later on. And I just have this very clear memory of my roommate. She was a harpist who then became a psychology major, like had quite a, like, trajectory during school. But I just remember her kind of poring over these books and being like so stressed about how to absorb all this material. And I was just like, I think that you might be learning wrong. I remember like having this conversation in her doorway. And I was like, I don't know how to say this, but I think the reason you're so stressed is because there is some method, or there is some kind of, again, prioritization form that you just haven't hit upon yet, because this is not the type of study you've had to do up till now. Because she was
requires a level of being able to predict what you need and don't need, which you don't have yet. You don't know what's going to be relevant.
Absolutely. Because she's coming from a practice which is very much about you practice all the time. Like, to become a great harpist, like your job is to put in 6 hours a day minimum. And she's going from that to something which is suddenly, it is less clear what you need to do to become a great psychologist, for example.
And so then from McGill, what was your next step?
I was very lucky to get an internship, which was based in New York with the Clinton Global Initiative. And I spent 6 months there. And I loved the experience, but I think there was something about New York that I was like, you know what? I think I am done with North America for now. I think I need to move back home. My first kind of full-time job over here was with the World Bank. I was kind of working on two very different projects with two different arms of the World Bank. One was in the governance unit. And at the time I was like, I don't know if this is for me. And the other thing that I did was with an organization. It's a think tank called CGAP, the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor, which is based out of the World Bank. But they work on issues of financial inclusion, etc. And so it had both topic specificity, but the work that I was doing then was actually starting up a new organization in Pakistan. They had a mandate from the Gates Foundation and what was then UK Aid, and now is called FCDO, to set up what they call a special purpose vehicle in Pakistan. And so that special purpose vehicle is what I ended up spending, I think for me, what I got really lucky with is that I fell in with a group of people that I found to be very inspiring. So what I've learned over time is that the subject, of course, matters, and eventually you will develop subject matter expertise in something. So that's not really something to worry about. But what you do need in life is mentors who are willing to help you get there. But not, it's mentorship, not just in the, I need to learn the subject. It's mentorship in how do you navigate a workplace.
Application.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that, for me, that experience was 100% all about that. And the most interesting parts almost, came later. Like the subject matter expertise came later. There was a whole piece of this, which was really about how do you set up an organization in Pakistan? How do you recruit people in Pakistan? How do you create procurement manuals for a company? How do you hire a consulting firm? So it was everything from soup to nuts. Right. And during that process, I feel like it was, again, all application, both learning and application kind of happening simultaneously.
So do you feel like what you studied in undergrad came into play or no?
Yeah, it's really terrible to say not at all, but not at all.
And I think that kind of links to my purpose and why I want this YouTube channel is because I fear that what I'm investing, because I do feel what I do is an investment in humans, little humans, but in humans. And
Yeah.
I feel like then when we get to these later stages, if it's not really applicable, then that brings me back to square one. Like, okay, then what is it that we need to teach so that it is? I'm always curious as to what can we do to change that, or is that just part of the process?
I mean, I think what I came out with, when I reflect back on it, I'm kind of like, what was the most useful thing university taught me? And it was like, I used to say this and people used to laugh, but it was like to read and write, honestly. It's like, how do you read material and how do you write well? And those are the two skills that you end up using, or at least I have ended up using more than anything else.
Yeah.
And it seems so simple and basic because it is.
Yeah.
But it's also it's incredibly complex. And that goes back to, have you learned how to prioritize? Have you learned to figure out what is important? And have you learned how to frame questions, and kind of analyze things? And so all of that is part of your learning. But there is no one thing that I could pinpoint to and say, oh yeah, it was that class. There's no singular class. It's nothing. It's the entire experience that gives you that.
Right.
So on the one hand, yes, absolutely nothing was applicable. And on the other hand, absolutely everything was applicable.
Right.
And that's kind of the funny thing I think about your undergrad, or at least my undergrad experience. I can't speak to everyone's.
So then after you were working in Pakistan, where did you end up after that?
And so I ended up applying to grad school and then ended up choosing to go full-time with public policy and went to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard.
So now you've had the Pakistan experience, you've had the Canadian experience, you had the American experience. So how would you compare the three?
For me, grad school was really like, it's a temporary off-ramp for life. So I really do recommend that you work for a couple of years, get that experience, and then go to grad school if your kind of field of study allows for that, because I think it gives you a greater appreciation for academia, but it also simultaneously is a great break from, the kind of the inevitable kind of drudgeries of working life that you will face. Yes. And so for those reasons, I found it to be extremely rewarding to have worked for a few years and then go to grad school. I think for me, I inevitably ended up making much more comparisons between kind of my undergrad and grad school, just because, you're going abroad for school. And I was like, okay, well, these are the two I'm comparing. And I think my mental state was very different for both of those. I think I really enjoyed grad school much more in a lot of ways, because by this point, the pressure was off. There was no sense of you have to do anything. It was just about, what do you want to do? What do you want to explore? You have this time, which is a gift, honestly. And so what are you going to spend that on? And so it, ended up being about choices beyond just the classroom. I had friends who really did go there for the classes, for example. They went there and they wanted to study and they wanted to do every class and they wanted to go see every famous professor and every lecture and do that life. And they found that to be incredibly rewarding. For me, I was kind of like, I'll participate in some of that. But for me, it was really about, are you pushing yourself outside the classroom? I always have found it, the social aspect, frankly, it was one that I was very worried about. And so I, a lot of time, building relationships, and kind of engaging more in extracurriculars, but also I would say choosing classes in a way that allowed me to focus more on application. And I guess these were all, when I think about it retroactively, were really, these are kind of the pieces that I felt were missing from my undergrad life. And so it was almost an opportunity to reintegrate those. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And what are some stereotypes about Ivy League schools that you can debunk for us?
Oh, stereotypes about Ivy League schools. God, I feel like, I don't know, you don't have to be a genius to be there. I think there is like a lot of mystique around Ivy League schools. I would say, particularly in your master's, you know, you are not there with people who have to be, who are necessarily the most brilliant, but you are there with people who are extremely motivated. And I think there is a difference.
If you had to pinpoint a character trait or basically a habit, whether it's, you know, being very hardworking or, as you said, motivated, what do you feel like you could say to, say, a fifth grader or a sixth grader who would be one to have goals of an Ivy League school, say? What would you say that we should be looking for, or that they should probably start practicing now to get to that place at the end of the road?
Well, I would say there is luck that motivates this as well, which I acknowledge. But you know, there's luck and privilege, and those are kind of necessary ingredients, and we can't discount those.
Correct.
But beyond luck and privilege, this is something that one of my professors said at grad school. But he was like, the thing that got you here is your ability to negotiate. And I remember the first time that he said that, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. That's an interesting thing to say. And he was like, no, you have done more than averagely well in life, negotiating different work situations, negotiating different life situations, negotiating your relationships with others to be able to get here. Because partially what is needed is people vouching for you. You know, and that sounds shocking, but there is such a big aspect of that. People vouching for you, people being invested in you, people being willing to, for example, do small things like read your essays, people being willing to give you advice. And then you spending time with individuals like that. And a lot of that is what ends up determining how you can meet your kind of ultimate goals, whether that is going to an Ivy League school or going to any other, like, you know, excellent school.
Right. So how does one negotiate?
I think there is the question of like, are you intrinsically motivated or are you extrinsically motivated? And I think this goes back to our broader conversation. I think there is a large part of our life, and I know this is true for me, where we were very extrinsically motivated. Yeah. There are expectations that are put on to you by your parents, by your schools, by your peers. And those determine certainly your academic and non-academic path for a long time.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time to kind of nurture that more, you know, intrinsic kind of motivation. So one of the reasons I use the word, you won't necessarily find the most like kind of academically gifted people at an Ivy League school, but you will find motivated people. And I think for people who were perhaps not the most academically gifted, it is about what are the goals they set for themselves. I think particularly there's a very good friend of mine who, he had a very circuitous route to the Kennedy School, but that's where he ended up. And part of that was just him deciding that's where I want to go. There is a lot to be said for, you know, what goals do you create for yourself and how can you negotiate past the barriers that have been, or limitations that have been imposed upon you. Yeah, for him, that was a limitation. It was huge that, for example, that he could not, you know, that he had a poor undergrad GPA. Yeah. But he ended up taking PhD level classes, which ended up letting him get into a different program than the one I did at HKS. And had worked for sufficient years that kind of, you know, the work experience and those PhD level classes, for example, were given more weight than perhaps what he had done a couple of years prior. Right. And so created a situation for himself in which he managed to get into a school that he had said was his aim for a very long time. And so there are different paths to success. I think we tend to only, like, I guess, focus on the most linear ones. And I think that can be very damaging, honestly. And again, I come back to, there is privilege and perseverance, I would call it. You know, everyone doesn't have the support that allows them to look beyond that. But um, if you can, there are ways to, again, negotiate to alternative pathways. But that's what kind of takes creativity and figuring out what your long-term motivation is.
Yeah, I think a word that we use in education a lot is grit. And as long
Yeah.
as you have that grit towards whatever that goal is. Something I've been noticing in a lot of the interviews I've been doing with the students is the inability for them when they're younger to look ahead. And I feel like that is such a skill to try and develop and nurture, because that would then obviously show them that, okay, I just have to hold on a little bit longer, because it's so easy to get discouraged. So do you feel like where you are is where you kind of anticipated you would be?
Oh, not at all. I mean, this is the funny thing, right? And I think this is kind of like the life lesson for everyone. I guess what we in our heads consider to be prestigious or whatever, we're like, oh, once you achieve that, then you're solid. God, I mean, I don't know what we imagine is going to happen, but we seem to think that if I do X, then suddenly my path forward from that is going to be easy breezy.
Yeah.
And that never happens. You are, I think for someone like me, you're always going to have imposter syndrome. You're always going to, worry about a million different things. And I think part of uh, part of dealing with the white space that I am currently in, for example, is uh, is embracing the natural chaos that comes with this part of life and understanding that that is kind of an integral part of it. Um, I think that's an incredibly hard thing to come to terms with. I think it's easier to say than to live through.
Absolutely.
But again, you should have goals. That is absolutely something that does, kind of keep us going.
Yeah.
And that's great. But I don't think you should never make the danger of assuming that if you achieve that goal, your life will suddenly be perfect, or it will go in the way that you have kind of perfected in your mind as a storyline. There is so much more that we have to contend with than just having great academics or having a great work life.
So much. Yeah.
And I think finding that balance is kind of key. And so that's what especially if I think about my academic journey, is kind of what I found, right? There was for me a significant transition between, especially undergrad and grad school, where it went from, this is just about the academics, to being like, actually, this is not. You're in a great place. You should enjoy it and take advantage of it. But at the same time, is that necessarily the most important thing that you're going to come away with?
Yeah.
I didn't think so at the time, and I'm very grateful that I ended up investing in other things and other experiences and other people.
Relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
So, looping back to the beginning of our conversation, you had mentioned managing conflict. What type of conversations or skills do you think you would implement to better prepare students for managing conflict later in life?
The two big things were learning to pause. That's going to sound a bit silly, but sometimes you're in the middle of an argument, and I am someone who can escalate from like 0 to 1,000, and I now know that about myself. Yeah, I can.
Oh.
But you have to. I think part of it is, and I'll get like drawn into an argument where I wasn't even like feeling particularly argumentative, and suddenly you're like, I'm in the middle of this. We're here. We're like fighting now, and so I think there is a point where if you can learn to pause and evaluate, oh, why am I feeling this way in this moment? It's an extremely difficult thing to do. It is not an easy thing at all, but like learning to pause is a huge one. And that is kind of about taking control of yourself. But the other one that I think is extremely important, and I have been exercising this more with my kind of loved ones, both family and friends, is learning to initiate difficult conversations. I think
yes, I love that.
It's incredibly difficult, as the name implies, to be the one to initiate something that can create emotional conflict. That kind of is the root of difficult conversations. But it again is a skill that you practice. I feel like the sooner you start, the better you get at it. I think both these skills are something that I learned terms for or came to much later in life. And the more I try to exercise it, and there are times that you're going to fail 100%. You're going to be like in the middle of something, you're going to fail. And then like 3 days later, you're going to be like, oh, if I had just like practiced this thing that I know to do, it would have made things so much better.
Yes.
But the more you practice it, I think the better you get at it, and the more at peace you get with some of this.
One of the last questions that I have, unless of course there's anything you'd like to add, is having gone through the educational journey that you have, you know, whether from Pakistan to McGill to Harvard, do you feel you could have learned what you've learned without having gone through that level of education? In other words, I don't want to send the message that I necessarily think that university is the only path, because clearly it's not. So do you feel you could have still learned what you've learned without attending, let's say, university, undergrad or grad?
The hope is yes, but I am very cognizant of the kind of opportunities that were open to me as a result of the steps that, you know, were kind of open. But at the same time, you know, as I said, I have friends who have reached very similar endpoints by taking very different pathways. And so it becomes to me a question of, can you find the right mentors? What kind of what are the creative solutions that you can implement, and what are kind of the, you know, how can you get to the endpoints that you have determined for yourself, and kind of keep faith through it all that you will get there. I think that's part of it.
Absolutely.
And I think there's something one of my professors said, you know, if you have an endpoint in mind, like getting to that goal it's not like sniper fire. So it's not about getting to that exact goal. He's like, it's more like throwing grenades. Like, even if you get close to that, that's more than good enough. And you need to appreciate that, and you need to value yourself for the ability to get there. Don't like undervalue or underestimate that.
Yeah, I feel like that. I really appreciate that, because obviously that also sounds like an emphasis on learning and appreciating the journey, even if you don't, for whatever reason, get there when you think you're supposed to get there. So I think that's fantastic. I really appreciate your time. Was there anything else that you wanted to add that I did not touch on?
No, I don't think so. Thanks for having me.
Of course, this was so much fun for me to do. I really appreciate your thoughts and learning more about you and your journey. That's very eye-opening for me too. So I appreciate you sharing that a lot.
No worries at all. Happy to do this.
Thank you so much. And say salam to everybody at home for me.
I will do that. I will do that. And salam to everyone over there.
Okay, well, they're in Pakistan.
Oh, okay, right. Of course, I forgot about that.
Right.
Hafiz.
Thank you.